The year was 1603, a time of profound and anxious transition for the Kingdom of England. The air in the royal palaces, once thick with the cloying scent of the aging Queen Elizabeth's perfumes and medicines, now held a different quality, a sharp, unfamiliar odor of change from the north. A new monarch, James VI of Scotland, had journeyed south to claim a second, greater crown as James I of England, uniting two perpetually warring nations under a single head. But what manner of head was it? He was a scholar, a theologian, a man whose intellect was renowned, yet behind the veneer of the philosopher-king lurked a profound and unsettling vulnerability. The question that hung in the perfumed, whispering galleries of Whitehall was not merely about policy or religion, but about the very nature of the man himself. How does a king's most private hunger, his desperate, almost pathological need for the intimate affection of beautiful young men, become a matter of state, a political tool, and ultimately, a creeping poison that threatens to corrupt the very heart of the realm? Prepare yourself for a tale of power and desire, where the royal bedchamber becomes the kingdom's most treacherous battlefield, and a king's touch could bestow fabulous wealth or a death sentence. This is not just the story of a king and his favorites. It is an exploration of how the immense, absolute power of a monarch can be held hostage by the most human and fragile of dependencies, a weakness that would set the stage for rebellion and the eventual collapse of the crown itself. The England that James inherited was a nation defined by the ghost of his predecessor. Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, had ruled for over 4 decades through a masterful projection of strength, mystique, and untouchable authority. Her court was a carefully balanced ecosystem of competing factions, all held in check by her refusal to be personally possessed, either by a husband or by a single, all-powerful favorite. Her death left a vacuum not just of power, but of identity. Into this void stepped a king whose entire life had been a study in contrast. James's childhood in Scotland was a brutal education in political survival. He was a king in his cradle, his father, Lord Darnley, murdered in a spectacular explosion when James was less than a year old, and his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, forced to abdicate and flee, eventually to an English prison and an executioner's block. He grew up a pawn in the vicious games of Scottish lords, a lonely, fearful boy who found solace not in the grim realities of statecraft, but in books and in the intense, suffocating affection of a few chosen companions. This background forged a man of deep and troubling contradictions. He possessed a sharp, pedantic intellect and authored treatises on subjects ranging from witchcraft to the divine right of kings, yet he was plagued by a profound lack of personal dignity, a slobbering speech, and a terrified aversion to drawn swords. He was at once the supreme head of the church and state, and a man desperately, openly, seeking a form of love that his society and his station could not publicly acknowledge or condone. His arrival in England was therefore not just a change of ruler, but an introduction of a new, deeply personal, and ultimately volatile element into the calculus of power. The Jacobean court, as it swiftly became known, was a world away from the calculated austerity of the late Elizabethan era. It was a place of shocking extravagance, of drunken masques where noble ladies were too intoxicated to stand, and of rampant spending that left the royal treasury gasping. It was also a hotbed of intellectual ferment and artistic brilliance, the age of Shakespeare and Donne. But beneath the glittering surface, a new political grammar was being written, one based not on counsel or merit, but on proximity to the king's person and his affections. This was the system of the favorite. James's reliance on such figures was not born in England. It was a pattern imported from his youth. In Scotland, he had been utterly captivated by his French cousin, Esme Stuart, whom he made Duke of Lennox, showering him with a love so intense it provoked a noble conspiracy that saw the favorite exiled. Now, on the grander stage of England, the stakes were higher, and the king's appetites were undiminished. Courtiers quickly learned that the path to advancement lay not in the council chamber, but in catching the king's roving eye. They were hunting for a new star to which they could hitch their political wagons. They did not have to wait long. The moment of discovery, as it so often is, was a matter of pure chance, a piece of theater that could not have been better scripted. During a royal tilting tournament in 1607, a handsome young man of Scottish descent named Robert Carr was tasked with presenting a shield and device to the king. In a twist of fate that sealed his destiny, His horse stumbled and fell, breaking the young man's leg directly in front of the royal box. The king, his compassion and another deeper interest immediately piqued, rushed to the young man's side, ordering his own physicians to attend him. That fall was not a misfortune, it was an ascension. As Carr convalesced, the king himself visited him constantly, not merely inquiring after his health, but teaching him, grooming him, molding him. He was a piece of clay, and the king was the sculptor, eager to create not just a companion, but a reflection of his own desires. The court watched, with a mixture of awe and disgust, as a new sun began to rise. The ascent of Robert Carr was a spectacle of royal obsession. From the injured squire nursed by a king, he rocketed through the ranks of the aristocracy, with a speed that left the established nobility breathless and simmering with resentment. He was knighted, then made a viscount, and finally, created the Earl of Somerset. He was showered with lands, monopolies, and immense wealth, but these were mere trinkets compared to the true prize, political power. James made him a gentleman of the bedchamber, a position of unparalleled intimacy that gave Carr access to the king at his most private and vulnerable moments. He became the sole conduit through which the river of royal patronage flowed. Petitions, appointments, and policies all had to pass through Carr's hands. He was the gatekeeper to the king, and he grew fabulously wealthy on the fees and bribes that this position commanded. Contemporary chroniclers and letter writers, like the astute John Chamberlain, reported with ill-disguised shock on the king's open displays of affection. James was seen to lean on Carr's arm, to pinch his cheek, to gaze at him with a startling intensity during council meetings. He reportedly declared that he could not be happy without his favorite, a public admission of emotional dependency that blurred the sacred line between the monarch's private person and his public office. This was not the calculated use of a favorite as a political tool, as Elizabeth had done. This was something far more raw and personal. Carr himself was an unlikely vessel for such immense power. He was noted more for his handsome face and fine physique than for any political acumen or intellectual depth. He was, in essence, a beautiful cipher, a man whose primary qualification was his ability to capture and hold the king's affection. The great lords of England, men from ancient and powerful families like the Howards and the Cecils, were forced to bow and scrape before this upstart, this creature of the king's passion. Their animosity was a dangerous, volatile force, coalescing in the shadows of the court. The kingdom was now effectively ruled by a duumvirate, the king and his beloved. It was a structure built not on the stable foundations of law and tradition, but on the shifting sands of a monarch's infatuation, and it was beginning to crack. The power of the Earl of Somerset, seemingly absolute, rested on a hidden foundation. That foundation was a man named Sir Thomas Overbury. Overbury was everything Carr was not: fiercely intelligent, politically astute, ruthlessly ambitious, and a brilliant writer. The two had met as young men, and a powerful bond formed between them. It was Overbury's mind that guided Carr's rise, his words that filled Carr's mouth in the council chamber, his strategies that solidified Carr's power. Theirs was a symbiotic relationship of beauty and brains, a partnership that dominated the court. But this partnership was destined for a catastrophic rupture, and the cause, as it so often is, was a woman. She was Frances Howard, daughter of the powerful Howard clan, and wife to the Earl of Essex. Trapped in a miserable, unconsummated political marriage, she was beautiful, headstrong, and utterly captivating. She and Robert Carr began a passionate, adulterous affair, a dangerous game played in the full glare of the court. Frances wanted more than a secret lover. She wanted a husband. She initiated proceedings to have her marriage annulled on the grounds of her husband's impotence, a scandalous and public humiliation. It was here that Sir Thomas Overbury made his fatal error. He saw Frances Howard not as an object of love, but as a political liability, a representative of a rival faction who would poison Carr's mind and sever their own profitable partnership. He fought the match with every fiber of his being, using his considerable influence and venomous wit to warn Carr away. He reportedly told his friend that the woman was noted for her injury and immodesty, and that to marry her would be the ruin of his honor and his fortune. He knew too much, and he spoke too freely. The lovers, incensed by his opposition, turned on him. A trap was laid. James, nudged by Carr, offered Overbury a foreign diplomatic post. When Overbury, preferring to stay at the heart of power, refused, the refusal was framed as an act of insolent disobedience to the king. In April of 1613, Sir Thomas Overbury, the architect of a favourite's fortune, was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, silenced at the behest of the very man he had made. The move sent a tremor of fear through the court. A man could be undone not by his enemies, but by his closest friend, with the quiet assent of a besotted king. The stone walls of the Tower of London were designed to hold a man's body, but they could also become his tomb. For Sir Thomas Overbury, his cell in the bloody tower was to be the site of a slow, agonizing, and meticulously planned execution. What followed was not the swift justice of the axe, but a creeping death administered drop by drop, a conspiracy of poison that reads like a Gothic horror. Frances Howard, with the complicity of her great-uncle the Earl of Northampton, and the silent, desperate assent of Robert Carr, orchestrated the murder plot from outside the walls. They secured a new, compliant lieutenant of the Tower and placed a man named Richard Weston as Overbury's personal keeper. Weston was not a guardian, he was an assassin. The plot was a masterpiece of insidious cruelty. The poisons were administered in Overbury's daily meals. Imagine the scene: a tray of food, a seemingly normal tart or a dish of jellies, arriving in the gloom of the cell. But mixed within were doses of white arsenic and cantharides, substances chosen to mimic the symptoms of a wasting disease, to make the death appear natural. When these proved too slow, more drastic measures were taken. Corrosive sublimate of mercury was added to his food and drink. The language of the apothecary's shop becomes the grammar of murder. Yet Overbury clung to life. His constitution was strong, and he fought back against the unseen enemy devouring him from within. The conspirators grew desperate. Finally, an apothecary's boy was sent in with a poisoned enema, a grotesque cocktail containing mercury sublimate. This final, horrific violation proved too much for his ravaged body. On the 15th of September, 1613, after months of torment, Sir Thomas Overbury died in agony. His body was a horror, emaciated, covered in sores, his skin discolored. He was buried with indecent haste within the Tower grounds, his story seemingly buried with him. The act itself was a product of the obsessive love between Carr and Frances, but its possibility, its execution in the king's own prison, was a direct result of the king's obsessive love for Carr. The royal favor that had elevated one man had become the shield for the murder of another. The darkness had been given permission to fester. With Overbury's ghost silenced beneath the chapel stones, Robert Carr and Frances Howard were free. Their path was clear. Frances's annulment was granted in a spectacle of a trial that scandalized the nation, with its explicit gynecological evidence, and in December of 1613, they were married in a ceremony of unparalleled magnificence, paid for by the king himself. Carr, now Earl of Somerset, stood at the absolute zenith of his power, his beautiful bride on his arm. He was untouchable, the king's beloved, shielded from all consequence. But murder is a persistent specter. The secret, held by a chain of conspirators, began to unravel. 2 years passed. The apothecary's boy, the one who administered the final, fatal enema, fell sick and, believing he was on his deathbed, confessed his part in the crime. The whisper became a rumor, the rumor an investigation. The Lord Chief Justice, Sir Edward Coke, a man of formidable intellect and unbending will, took charge of the inquiry. The chain of complicity was followed link by painful link, from the keepers to the lieutenant of the Tower, all the way to the gilded couple themselves. The revelation sent a shockwave through the kingdom. King James was thrown into a state of profound agitation. He was the fount of all justice in his realm, a role he took with theological seriousness, yet the accused were his dearest friend and his wife. He wept, he raged, he vacillated. In a moment of public anguish, he reportedly swore a solemn oath, invoking God's curse upon himself and his posterity if he spared any person found guilty. The trials that followed were the sensation of the age. The lesser conspirators were tried, convicted, and hanged, one by one. Then came the turn of the Countess and the Earl of Somerset. Frances pleaded guilty. Carr, arrogant to the last, maintained his innocence. He was convicted in a dramatic trial, his fall as spectacular as his rise. The king was left with a terrible choice: to uphold his sacred oath and send the man he loved to the gallows, or to make a mockery of his own justice. In the end, his affection, though broken, won out. He spared their lives, commuting the death sentences to imprisonment in the Tower, the very place their victim had perished. The great favorite had fallen, leaving a gaping void at the king's side. The fall of one son necessitates the rise of another. Nature and the Jacobean court abhors a vacuum. Even as the Somerset scandal was reaching its lurid climax, the factions opposed to the fallen favorite were already grooming his replacement. They had learned a vital lesson. To control the kingdom, one had to control the king's heart, and the key to that heart was an exquisite face and a graceful form. Their candidate was a young man named George Villiers. He was, by all accounts, a figure of almost supernatural beauty. A contemporary described him as the handsomest bodied man in all of England. He was brought to court in 1614 and strategically placed where the king could not fail to notice him. The effect was instantaneous and electric. James was utterly, completely, and immediately besotted. If his affection for Carr had been a consuming fire, his love for Villiers was a supernova. He gave the young man the pet name Steenie, a reference to St. Stephen, who was said to have had the face of an angel. The rise of George Villiers was even more vertiginous than that of his predecessor. He was knighted, made a viscount, an earl, a marquess, and finally the Duke of Buckingham, a title of almost royal significance. The king's letters to him survive, and they are documents of startling emotional and physical intimacy. James referred to Buckingham as his sweet child and wife, and himself as Buckingham's dear dad and husband. It was a relationship of such open intensity that it left no room for doubt or interpretation. The court, ever adaptable, simply realigned itself around this new center of gravity. The factions that had engineered Villiers' ascent, believing he would be their puppet, soon discovered their miscalculation. Villiers was no Robert Carr. He was not a passive beauty. He was intelligent, charming, politically ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He learned quickly that his power depended on one thing and one thing only: his absolute personal and emotional dominance over the King of England. The kingdom had simply traded one master for another, more capable one. The pathological pattern in the king's psychology was laid bare for all to see, a cycle of obsession and elevation that subordinated the well-being of the state to the monarch's desperate need for companionship. The reign of Buckingham was not merely a repeat of the Somerset era, it was an escalation. Where Carr's power had been largely domestic, a matter of patronage and court intrigue, Buckingham's influence extended to the very highest levels of international diplomacy and state policy. He became, in effect, the co-ruler of England. The king's dependence on him was total. James, aging and increasingly infirm, delegated almost all executive authority to his magnificent favorite. Buckingham's word was law. His family was enriched, his allies promoted, his enemies crushed. This outsourcing of monarchical power to a single, unelected individual had catastrophic consequences for the nation. The Duke's ambition and arrogance led him to pursue a series of disastrous foreign policy adventures. The most notorious of these was the Spanish match. In 1623, in a move of breathtaking diplomatic foolishness, Buckingham and the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, traveled incognito to Spain in an attempt to secure a marriage treaty with the Spanish Infanta. The expedition was a humiliating failure. It not only failed to secure the marriage but also needlessly antagonized one of Europe's great powers and inflamed anti-Catholic sentiment back home. Domestically, Buckingham's policies were equally unpopular. He championed costly and unsuccessful military campaigns and was widely and correctly blamed for the nation's financial woes. Parliament, which had been wary of the king for years, now had a focal point for its hatred. Buckingham became known as the grievance of all grievances, the source of all the kingdom's ills. He was impeached by Parliament, a move the king furiously resisted. The symbiotic relationship between the old king and his young wife had become a national liability. The intimate bond that brought James personal solace was driving his kingdom toward a constitutional crisis. The whispers in the palace galleries had grown into a roar of public dissent, a political storm that was gathering force and would, in the next reign, break upon the head of the king's son. The seeds of the English Civil War were being watered by a king's tears of affection for his beautiful, disastrous duke. The final years of King James I were a slow, somber descent. His body, never strong, began to fail him. He was tormented by arthritis, gout, and kidney stones. His physical decay a grim metaphor for the political state of his kingdom. The intellectual sharpness that had once earned him the title of the wisest fool in Christendom was clouded by pain and fatigue. Through it all, his one constant was Buckingham. Steenie remained at his side, his power absolute, his presence the only balm for the king's suffering. James's dependency became even more pronounced, his letters filled with a pathetic, desperate need for reassurance and affection. He was a king in title, but a subject in heart, utterly captive to the man he had created. As we reflect on his reign, we are confronted with a legacy of profound contradiction. This was the king who successfully united the crowns of Scotland and England, a political feat that had eluded monarchs for centuries. He was a genuine scholar who sponsored the single most influential book in the English language, the King James Bible, a work whose poetic cadences shaped the very soul of the language. Yet this same man, through a deep-seated personal flaw, set his kingdom on the path to self-destruction. His inability to separate the personal from the political, his elevation of private desire over public duty, corroded the foundations of the monarchy. He taught his son, Charles, a fatal lesson: that a king's will was absolute and that favorites could be used to bypass the traditional structures of government like Parliament. It was a lesson Charles would take to heart, and it would lead him, ultimately, to the executioner's scaffold. The symbolism is inescapable. The physical body of the king, the body politic, was sick. The court was corrupt, the treasury was empty, and the relationship between crown and people was fractured. James did not cause the English Civil War, but his reign created the conditions that made it inevitable. His personal vulnerability, his human aching need for love and intimacy, became a political cancer that metastasized throughout his kingdom, a weakness that the awesome power of divine right could not cure. As we conclude our journey into the shadowed heart of the Jacobean court, we are left to ponder the timeless and unsettling themes that emerge from the life of King James I. We began with a question of how a king's private desires could become a poison in the veins of the state, and we have seen the answer played out in a drama of obsession, murder, and political ruin. The story of James and his favorites is more than just a historical curiosity, more than a morbid tale of royal scandal. It is a profound meditation on the nature of power itself. It reveals that absolute authority is a fragile construct, perpetually vulnerable to the most mundane and powerful of human emotions: loneliness, desire, and the desperate need to be loved. The narrative of James's reign serves as a powerful thematic bookend to our exploration. It demonstrates with chilling clarity that no amount of theological justification for divine right can insulate a kingdom from the flaws of its king. The monarch's bedchamber, in this case, became an extension of the council chamber, and his personal affections became the national budget. The result was a government built not on reason or justice, but on the shifting whims of infatuation. This is the enduring, philosophical implication of James's reign. It poses a rhetorical question that echoes through the centuries. How can any system that concentrates so much power in a single, flawed human being hope to remain stable? James was not a monster. He was, in many ways, a sympathetic and tragic figure, a lonely boy who became a lonely king, perpetually seeking a security and love he could never truly find. But his personal tragedy became his kingdom's crisis, a legacy of debt, division, and disaster that he bequeathed to his unfortunate son. The story of the king who forced his courtiers into his bed is ultimately a grim reminder of the intimate, often horrific, connection between the psychology of a leader and the destiny of a nation.